chapter, Jesus sets us free. And so I want to begin with one question for you to respond to, which is, where in the world do we observe people who need to be set free? So where do you see people, what circumstances or situations have you observed where it appears that people are needing to be set free? Any initial responses that come to mind?
Everywhere.
Just everywhere? Anything more specific than everywhere?
Well, there's a history of alcoholism in my family, and
Okay.
I think anyone that has an addiction to drugs or alcohol, or even food, anything, they need to be set free from that. And no matter how much you pray for that, sometimes I don't know how it works, but sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah. So addictions are definitely something from which people need to be freed. Rick?
I saw a sign in the restroom, for example, this morning at Love's. It said, employees must wash hands. If employee not available, please wash your own hands.
That's nice. We may need to be set free from your jokes. Doug?
Prejudice?
Prejudice. Yeah. We need to be set free from our own prejudices. The world needs to be set free from bigotry and the ugly expressions of prejudice that come from it, I think. Other thoughts?
Like military, those who come back with all the
Yeah,
trying to become a civilian again. And
right. When folks come back from serving, especially if they've been in combat, the coming back into society can be very hard.
Especially if they have wounds, disabilities.
Right.
PTSD.
Yeah.
It's kind of like Kairos, the ministry of them being in prison.
Yes.
They somehow the Lord goes to that prison,
Yes.
obviously. One of the many people who have been imprisoned and lifted up.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, just because you're in prison doesn't mean the Lord's not there. And
That's right.
People.
Yeah.
I just thought of that one. So,
Incarcerated people are people.
yes.
Uh-huh. Lee?
I think we need to be set free from our worldly lust for money or things
Yeah.
and put it more into the spiritual. What we really need to concentrate on is our spiritual life more than the physical life.
Okay. So being set free from greed and materialism and to be freed in order to focus more on our spiritual lives. Thank you. Cindy?
From the toxic relationships, like I can think it kind of plays on the alcoholism, but also abuse, whether it's spousal or child abuse, it tends to repeat in generations, and
Right.
just those toxic relationships, pulling people into bad relationships.
Yes. Yes. So the toxic relationships and there's like a ripple effect whenever there is one person who is addicted. It impacts not just them, but there's this ripple effect that can actually have an impact generationally, and the way in which a family can sort of end up enabling the alcoholic and can lead to some very unhealthy ways of being and relating. So yeah, being set free from all of that toxicity. Thank you.
I
Carolyn?
have one more. I was watching the Today Show this morning, and Jenna Bush and Michelle Obama had been in Vietnam working with the women that had been denied education.
Okay.
And a lot of the family members of the young women over there today still, if their daughters try to go to school, they'll burn their books so they won't go to school, so they'll stay home and work.
Mm.
And I just think it would be wonderful if everyone in this world had a freedom from illiteracy. And, you know, it was interesting seeing them together and work on such a thing, because Jenna's following in her grandmother's steps as far as education and reading, etc.
Okay.
But to think that young people, and it was mainly the women
Uh-huh.
that they were focusing on.
Right.
So freedom from illiteracy would just go a long way in this world.
Yes. So illiteracy is a is something that people need to be free from around the world. And as Carolyn said, especially women, it seems to be a bigger problem for women globally.
Can I share one?
Yes.
I would say self-doubt, freedom from self-doubt.
Okay.
I know that a lot of times we make assumptions about what other people will think of us and about us if we act and do and say things certain ways. And so, sometimes you just need Jesus to say, let it go and go do what I tell you to do, or just be who you are without worrying,
So being freed from self-doubt.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Kind of similar, what I was just gonna say is almost being free from yourself, like the control that your mind can take over. I was thinking it's attack on your thoughts and how powerful letting one of those thoughts take over all of your actions and all that can be.
Yeah.
So,
Yes. Yes. Thank you. Wonderful. Great. Great thoughts. So we read this story in our chapter about somebody named Miss Ruby. And I thought I would just go ahead and, it's kind of a longish story, but it's good. So I'm just going to read it to you. And it begins on page 34. I'm sure you've read it, but just in case. Page 34. Miss Ruby. One Christmas Eve a few years ago, I hosted Room in the Inn with my sister, brother-in-law, and a dear friend of ours named Miss Ruby. Room in the Inn is a national program in which different city churches invite people who are experiencing homelessness to eat a meal and spend the night during the cold months. It was the first time in my 5 years of serving at this particular church that our host night fell on Christmas Eve. When I heard in staff meeting that our night fell on Christmas Eve and that they needed volunteers, I knew without a doubt there was no other way I would want to celebrate the birth of Jesus Christ. Immediately following the staff meeting, I texted my sister, Siona, to see if she was up for being a host with me. Then I made my way to Miss Ruby's home to talk with her and her caretakers to see if it was something she wanted to do and could do without too much stress. You have to understand, Miss Ruby is like family to me, and she was born with intellectual disabilities. Our friendship began when we shared meals together at church, and eventually it evolved into movie dates, porch swing conversations, dance parties on road trips to church retreats, and holidays when Siona and I had the joy of hosting Miss Ruby at our house. Christmas that year happened to be one of the holidays when Miss Ruby was going to be with us. After receiving the okay from her caretakers, I had a conversation with Miss Ruby to ask her if she was up for hosting Jesus for dinner and staying overnight at church following the Christmas Eve service. She said yes, absolutely delighted at the thought of hosting Jesus. When Christmas Eve arrived, we were all giddy with joy and anticipation, especially Miss Ruby. The tables had been set for dinner, the 12 bed mattresses had been prepared, and Miss Ruby was on the edge of her seat, waiting for our guests to arrive. Then the moment came. "They're here, Miss Ruby," I told her. "Oh, she yelped. She got out of her chair and quickly walked toward the glass door with her arms opened wide. As the 12 men filed in, Ruby greeted each one of them with, "Hello, Jesus, ho, ho, ho." Throughout the evening, as she talked with the men, shared a meal with them, and attended to their needs, she called them Jesus. Every now and then, during the evening, she would let us know how she was doing. "Happy here, Ruby, happy here." I paid close attention to the Christmas story unfolding in the community center that night. There were so many sacred moments. I breathed in the goodness and love of God that flowed through the room in our guests, the hosts, and those who prepared the meal. I was most captivated by Miss Ruby's ability to see Jesus in each of the guests and their ability to see Jesus in her. Her loving spirit brought a smile of joy to each face. She moved around the room, freely offering her presence and friendship with authenticity, acceptance, and unconditional love. It was compelling. Equally as compelling were the kindness, respect, and acceptance the guests extended to Ruby. There was one moment when she turned to a guest who had just finished singing a Christmas song with her and said, "I love you, Jesus." He looked at her and said, I love you too, Miss Ruby. When it was bedtime and Miss Ruby noticed all the men settling down on their mattresses for the night, she quietly packed her stuff and got ready to leave, not realizing that hosting room in the inn meant sleeping on an airbed on the gym floor. Ruby ready, she said, coat on and purse in hand. Oh, Miss Ruby, we're staying here tonight, I said. We're the hosts, remember? She was quiet for a moment, then looked at me and said, Jesus? I replied, yes, Miss Ruby, Jesus. She handed me her purse, took off her coat, and said, okay. Miss Ruby climbed into the bed we made for her. Then she looked at the mattresses lined up against the gym wall and said, good night, Jesus. Ho, ho, ho. On Christmas morning, all of us ate breakfast together. Then we got into the van and took the men back. As they climbed out of the van, Miss Ruby said to each one, bye, Jesus. Ho, ho, ho. To which every single one of them responded, bye, Ruby, or Merry Christmas, Ruby. On our way back to church, we passed 3 men who were experiencing homelessness in the neighborhood around our church. I was so focused on the road that I missed seeing them, but not Miss Ruby. She pointed and said to me, buddy, Jesus is there. See Jesus? I stopped, looked to my right, and saw Steve, Alan, and John, 3 friends experiencing homelessness. We still had food left from our Christmas breakfast, so we invited our friends into the van and headed to the church where all of us shared breakfast leftovers. Jesus was there. What do you think about Miss Ruby teaching us about seeing Jesus in other people? How does she teach us to do that? Diana?
Well, what struck me first of all was the fact that he had such a relationship with Ruby that he knew that she could minister to people, whereas oftentimes people with disabilities, you feel like they need to be ministered to.
Uh-huh.
She was the one that was going to minister to this audience. And he knew that because he had an established relationship with her.
Okay.
And he knew that she saw things from a different perspective,
Yes.
from a very innocent, non-judgmental, very innocent, sweet Jesus perspective.
Yeah.
And because he knew that about her, she could be the one that could minister to her.
Yeah, very good. And so Ruby was able to see something that the author was somehow unable to see. But then because Ruby was able to see that and speak to it, there was something that happened for the author, which was a learning for her. And I think that, Diana, I actually think that the person writing it is a woman. So,
Oh, all right.
Yeah.
Her.
News.
Oh, you think the person that wrote the story is a woman? I thought so too.
Yeah.
Oh, well,
Because there's one little reference where we find out her name is Lanisha.
Oh,
So,
okay.
But anyway, Doug?
I missed that.
Most of us tend to focus too much on the superficial. What we see with our eyes directly, how someone's dressed, how they walk, whether they're shaven and so forth, rather than look for something deeper.
Yes. Well, the author said that Ruby, and it's something that Diana alluded to also, which is that Ruby helped her to become more aware of her own sight impairedness. What do you think that means? That the author of this story became aware of her own sight impairedness.
Well, maybe she just saw homeless men, and then when she was with Miss Ruby, and Miss Ruby saw these men as Jesus, the author saw these men as Jesus.
Right. Yeah.
And that's true of a lot of us. We see someone on the street and immediately have a judgmental thing in our brain.
Stereotype.
Yeah.
But Jesus said, when you do to others, you're doing it to me.
Right.
Like when you can't feed somebody, you're feeding me.
Yes.
So.
And thank you for mentioning that, because I think that is the kind of scriptural background on this whole concept of seeing the divine in people, seeing in people the presence of Jesus.
Right.
It's because he told us that whenever you've done it to the least of these, you've done it unto me. Why do you think some of the reasons are that we miss seeing the divine in other people? Why is it that we sometimes fail to see that? Where does that sight impairedness come from?
We're so busy.
Busyness, okay?
Being self-absorbed.
or the way they
being
look or don't talk.
self-absorbed because of the way they look, right? As Doug mentioned, you see this person who's unshaven or whatnot.
Fear.
Fear can keep us from seeing things, for sure.
I think we don't see it in ourselves.
Ah.
I think that that makes us not even in that realm to look at it in other people. I mean, that's just not part of our DNA.
Okay, so we first fail to see it in ourselves to realize our own sacred worth, which makes it difficult for us to see the sacred worth of others. Yes. Doug?
Societal norms,
Societal norms, say more on that.
well, just what's considered acceptable and proper and good versus what's not.
Okay,
It tends to influence how we think,
okay,
what we see, or how we judge people.
okay, sure. So there is this notion of something called the sacrament of the blessed present. You ever heard of that? The sacrament of the blessed present, or another way to say it is the sacrament of the present moment. And that there's, it has to do with acknowledging that God is in your midst in a moment. And sometimes we fail to recognize God in the moment, maybe because we are rarely actually in the moment ourselves. I think if you're anything like me, you're thinking about what's coming up or what just happened rather than what's going on right now. Does that ring true for anybody else? So that it makes it difficult to see the divine in a moment when we're either living our lives in the future or in the past because we're not focused on the present moment. And yet somehow in this story we see that Miss Ruby is able to be in the moment. She's able to live in the sacrament of the present moment. What do you think Miss Ruby's impact might have been on the men gathered that night?
Great.
Probably they were amazed that they were so accepted and loved.
Yeah. So they were amazed. They were, they felt loved. Diana?
Well, to be called Jesus, and to think that somebody thinks of you that way is elevating.
Yes. It elevates you to be considered in such high regard. Yeah. And you'd imagine that would be a very different kind of experience for somebody who is experiencing homelessness, that would not be the norm. We heard from George last week talk about his experience of spending a week in homelessness, and how I think I remember you saying, George, that people looked at you differently than they did when you were not in that life for that week. That people treated you differently and they spoke to you differently. And so that had to be, as you said, an elevating experience.
George, is it true that your wife kicked you out of the house and you were homeless?
Somebody else done that or considered
Yeah.
Well, I'd invite you to turn to Luke chapter 4, if you have your Bible. Luke chapter 4, and we're going to look at verses 16 through 19. Luke 4, 16 to 19. Would somebody be willing to read those verses to us, please? Out loud?
I got it.
Thank you, Candy.
He went to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and on the Sabbath day he went into the synagogue, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. On rolling it, he found the place where it is written, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom to the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." Then he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fastened on him. He began by saying to them, "Today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." to, did you say 24?
Actually to 19, but thank you for, that kind of concluded the story, I think. Appreciate that. So kind of hold that in your mind, and then let's look back at Isaiah 61, verses 1 through 4.
I'll do that.
Okay, thanks.
61, 1 through 4.
61, 1 through 4.
The Spirit of the Lord Jehovah is upon me, because Jehovah hath appointed me to preach good tidings unto the meek. He hath sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison to them that are bound, to proclaim the year of Jehovah's favor, and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn, to appoint unto them the mount that mourn in Zion, to give unto them a garland for ashes, the oil of joy for mourning, garment of praise for the spirit of heaviness, that may be called trees of righteousness, the planting of Jehovah, that he may be glorified. And they shall build the old waste, they shall raise up the former desolations, and they shall repair the waste cities, the desolations of many generations.
Okay, thank
Well,
you.
what is the timeline on this? Is this before his ministry or?
This is a long time before his ministry. This is the prophet Isaiah. And so when Jesus read from Isaiah 61 in Nazareth, of course, as we talked about on Sunday, essentially what he's doing is he's saying, and he says that this is being fulfilled in your hearing. He's essentially saying that I'm the one who has come to do these things, that I'm the one who's come to bring this liberation that has been prophesied for so long. It was something that had been waited for a very long time. The people were waiting for this to occur, and then it finally occurs in Jesus. In what way do you think that people might have thought that it didn't really line up with what they were expecting? How do you think Jesus' fulfillment of this prophecy was similar to or different from what they were expecting?
Well, he was a carpenter, he was nobody.
Okay, so he was a nobody, that's right, okay. So it wouldn't, maybe he would have been unexpected to be nobody would have thought he would have been the one, okay. But in the ways that he actually fulfills this, how is the fulfillment of this maybe different than people's expectations? Cindy?
Well, I think these things he's talking about here, freedom for the prisoners, recovery of the blind, releasing the oppressed, is kind of more of a little grassroots sort of thing, where they were expecting someone to just come in and, lightning to flash, and they would rule over everybody and everything.
Right.
And instead, they're just, he's starting at the bottom and working his way up.
Right, yes. And when in verse 4, it says, they shall build up the ancient ruins, they shall raise up the former devastations, they shall repair the ruined cities, the devastations of many generations, which I think I would be expecting somebody who would come and do a building program, Let's have a capital campaign and let's build a building. Instead, what he did was, he actually did heal people, but he did so much more than that because it went beyond the physical. The author of our chapter, she suggests that Jesus' ministry is the same as what our ministry is to be, and that we are also sent to be offering empowering and enabling words to people who feel stifled by their life circumstances. Because in essence, that's what Jesus did. He went to people whose life circumstances were stifling them, and he released them from those circumstances. Because remember that if you are a blind person, or you had any kind of a physical something, the Old Testament scriptures would have made it where you were not allowed to be part of the temple life. You would not be allowed to enter the temple if you had a physical, I'm not coming up with the right word, but you know what I mean. Disability, imperfection, flaw, yeah. And so by healing them, he not only healed them of the thing that was maybe a problem for them in just living life, but it also freed them to be to have a full life in the life of God by being able to participate in temple life. So it was a freeing that was much deeper than even the physical infirmity. We've talked a little bit already about this, but I would like to just offer it from a different angle. Who are people or groups that you can think of that are living in stifling circumstances? What people or what groups of people can you think of who are living in stifling circumstances?
I think caregivers of people who are either terminal or need constant care
Okay.
has got to be
Yeah.
stifling. I mean, because the caregiver, essentially gives up his or her life
Okay.
for that other person.
So people who are caregivers can be that can be a stifling circumstance for them.
Yeah, they're not really overlooked, but it always, when I pray for people, I pray for the caregiver because that's got to be so hard, and they're really giving up stuff.
Right.
Lots of stuff.
Right. Okay.
In reverse, just people with disabilities.
People who have disabilities.
I know we pray a lot for people that serve a community or police department, fire department. But I think somebody pointed out to me about a year ago, the wrecker service, the ones who pick up the vehicles after the accidents, that they're not remembered or prayed or thought about because they clean up the site and see all that's left.
Yeah.
And they have a lot of stuff to deal with too, depression and things that they see.
Right.
And I feel like they're forgotten.
Right. Yeah.
To my mind, we were all handicapped, we were all deprived, we were all have something wrong with us, one way or the other.
In one way or another, or something. Sure.
Including Bill Gates.
Including those.
I lost my mind a long time ago.
I'm still looking at it.
I never had one to lose.
Mary Adele accepts it.
George, so funny.
I think the unbelievers.
Unbelievers are stifled. Okay. How so?
I think that when you are a believer and you believe that Jesus Christ died for your sins, the freedom in knowing that is such a release in your life.
Yeah.
And they don't know.
They don't know what they don't know. Doug?
The unintentional destitute.
Unintentional destitute.
Those who through no fault of their own, nothing,
Okay.
lost all assets, all money, all everything.
Okay. So folks who, just to repeat, the folks who don't have lost everything, not by no fault of their own. And so it was unintentional, but they have found themselves in that position.
It's gotta be stifling.
Stifling, sure.
I think that we need to think about our young men and women in the armed services that are serving overseas and can't be home with their families, if even in a joyous situation or an illness type situation. I would think they would feel stifled because they're there and they can't do anything about it.
Okay. People who are separated from their families
Separated
because of
from
service.
their families and really no fault of their own, and they're doing something good, but they're still stifled.
Yeah.
It's almost a handicap.
Sure. A group of people that it bothers me that people are feeling the need to leave their home country where they have roots, where they have had generations of people living, to leave their home country, to walk thousands of miles to come to the U.S. border, and then to be turned away or to be mistreated in some way or another. I mean, to know even that, okay, I'm going to make this journey and my chance of getting in is really slim. But what bothers me the most is what would motivate a person to pick up and leave? What's going on in their town that would make them want to do that. And anyway,
Or they have the ones that are already here and can't go back home, because once they cross the border, they won't be able to come back to the US, so they're waiting here.
waiting here for
And they're trying to
family.
establish
Yeah,
some type of residency here, and a lot of times, they're trying to go about the right way, and then we have Americans that go, lawyers and people that take their money and do not do what's right for them.
right.
So it's a constant
Yeah,
battle for them.
right. Well, one of the things that we hear the author doing is, notice that when she speaks of the homeless, how she speaks of them, the language that she uses. Did you notice that? So how does she refer to those people? Friends, okay.
Compassion.
Experiencing homelessness.
People experiencing
As
homelessness.
opposed to the homeless.
The homeless, yes. And what's the significance in that change of language?
They're still God's people.
Okay, they're God's people, okay.
It's
Yes.
not completely their identity.
Say that again?
It's not completely their identity. If you're experiencing something, it gives you the indication that it might be temporary,
Okay,
as opposed to that being you.
the label of who you are, yeah.
Also
Brenda?
connotes it's a temporary thing.
60 minutes.
Yeah, that it's a temporary thing instead of something that's your permanent identity. Yes.
60 Minutes had a thing on the homelessness in Seattle last week. And they had 3 families they showcased. And one was a couple with a little baby that had a lot of medical issues. And that they had been on drugs and they couldn't get anybody to let them, even though they saved up, even though they had jobs. They couldn't get anybody that would, because of the high rise in property values, they couldn't get anybody that would let them live in their whatever. One of the gentlemen was an alcoholic, and he had a job, but he didn't make enough money to afford an apartment. And so eventually he got on the bus to ride to this job. I think it was a janitor or something. And but when they checked back with him, he had lost his apartment and job or whatever. I forget the third one, but what the bottom line was, they said that really it was because of the property values going up exponentially that caused all of these people to be homeless. They have tent cities.
Yes.
And that was not due to people wanting that.
Right.
It was just the circumstances of
Yes.
the property values. It
Yes.
was very interesting because, like they said, you think, oh, someone is hopeless because they won't work, but that was not the case.
Right.
And so it was very interesting. It makes me look at homelessness a lot differently because I taught so many children who they lived with their grandparents or aunt and uncle or whatever. And if you didn't have, if your parents were not the primary person at the home, then you were considered homeless. And so these children were on, and I taught the 99% poverty stricken. These children had their free luncheon and their free, their free meals, whatever. And they would come for breakfast. They might not eat it, but their mothers were just as hungry. And it wasn't me, but the principal would not let those mothers, you have to get back, you cannot eat their stuff, but the kids would throw their stuff away. That's hungry people. So I've been retired for a long time. I don't know if things are still the same, but that's how it used to be. And it is sad, it really is.
Yeah, it is. And you've reminded me of something. So, I've shared 1,000 times that I used to be a violin maker, and
I played the violin.
but I did not play. But an aspect of my job was that for the shop, I was the sales rep for HISD, And so,
That's where I learned to play the violin. was
Okay.
HISD.
yeah. So I used to go, I mean, I went to like every school in HISD that had like an orchestra. And I went all over the city. And I was recently in a neighborhood, and I was driving down this little street, and it had all these like luxury apartment buildings now. But I was driving along, and I saw this school, and I was like, I used to take supplies to that school. But when I used to take supplies to that school, this was not the neighborhood it is today. It was all these really run-down homes that were just in total disrepair all around there. And now it's just like Yuppieville, you know. Well, on one hand, it's like, oh, this is a nice neighborhood now. It's really nice to be here. But on the other hand, it bothered me because I thought, where did the people go? I mean, this was where they were able to afford to live. Where are they now? What happened when the person who used to rent the home to them got bought out or, you know, sold out and built up this expensive place?
And that's all over Houston.
It's all over Houston. Yeah, I don't know what the solution is, but it bothers me.
Because you know there's some children out there who are going without food.
Yes.
And you don't, and this is my fault as much as anybody else, but you wanted them to look like all the other children. You know, when we got backpacks and supplies for them so that they wouldn't feel so different, you made them feel the same, but they're really not the same.
Yeah.
So I don't know what the answer is. I taught forever, and we would work on it every year, but there is a difference.
Well, so one of the things that I have not done a very good job of sharing with the church, I have to admit, is that we've been engaged, maybe haven't even know, probably don't even know this, so I'm just going to tell you. So we have a member in our church who works for Lamar ISD, Kelly Kipping. And Kelly's responsibility is helping make things work for homeless students, and homeless being defined by not having a place that is really their house or their you know, so they may be sleeping on a couch. And so every once in a while, Kelly will get into a bind where she doesn't have the funding to help a student in a particular situation. And it may be, in a lot of cases, it'll be something like the kid just needs, or the family just needs one night stay in a hotel. And then after that one night, then they get into their new apartment that has been arranged for. But there will be these gaps, and Kelly doesn't have the resources. So she and I have this side deal going where she'll call me or email me and say, I've got a student, here's the situation. And I feel confident that she has vetted this situation very carefully. And so I take money from the bread fund. And so when the Panera Bread stuff on Sunday mornings gets sold, the money from that goes into this fund we have called Faith to Faith. And I use the money that's in Faith to Faith to help cover these homeless situations. So I needed to let you. It's my little slush fund for Jesus. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So buy the bread on Sunday.
Yeah.
It's good bread.
You know, when Dick was so sick and he fell and cut himself all up and got blood on the sofa. So when we took him out of the bed, and I brought a chair so that he would get out of the bed, I had them load the sofa in the back of his truck. And I went from every place trying to get rid of that sofa, and nobody would take it except on 36. The woman in Ray's said, you know, my mom has a resale shop. Let me call her. And so he called her. She says, yeah, I can get that blood out. I mean, even poor people don't want things that are not pristine.
Yeah.
And my granddaughter would have loved it. And I could have gotten the blood out. This lady did get the blood out and sold it. And she said, and I donated the money. I said, I didn't care what you did. I didn't know what to do with it. And So that was a real lesson to me. I was like, "Oh, okay."
Lee?
Goodwill.
John, I think there's a lot of members here at our church that would love to help people that are in need, but don't know how.
Okay.
Providing Christmas dinner, Thanksgiving dinner, bringing them in for a night or so, put them up in our house, but we don't know how to connect with them. And I don't know if there's a program out there that would allow that. Maybe that's something.
There are programs, they're not all wonderful. It's a difficult task of getting the right program for the church is sometimes challenging.
Yeah.
But thank you for that. Cindy?
One of the things that I've dealt with in my career, as far as my work life, is Section 8 housing. And one of the things, and that's where people get vouchers when they can't afford the rent. The government literally pays the rent directly to the landlord every month. Once you get them set up, the landlord has to agree to a Section 8, and then the government actually sends the check to the landlord. So the landlord doesn't have to worry that they won't get their money. So it's actually a pretty secure situation. But one of the problems that I've seen with the program is, well, there's several problems, but the main one is there seems to be help out there for many people that, I don't know how to say this, aren't really interested in changing their situation.
Uh-huh.
They don't want to, and the big gap I've seen is there's not a lot of help for the working poor.
Mm-hmm.
And my husband and I talked about this, and he's in the medical industry. He works in an emergency room, and he said the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
He said the people that don't work, that, you know, whether you want to say responsible or irresponsibly, have like 8 kids. I mean, I've had somebody come, they've got, with a Section 8 voucher, and they've got 10 kids.
Mm-hmm.
Like every 18 months, she's had a child. And, you know, you can say whatever you want about your philosophy on that, but if you can't support even a family of 3, it gets a little distorted. But then you'll have somebody that's a single mother with 2 children, and her mom lives with her because she's disabled, and they can't get help because she has a job making $10 an hour.
Mm-hmm.
That's the group that I see that's really falling through the cracks, is the working poor.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, I mean, so in some ways, we encourage people to just not even work and have nothing.
Uh-huh.
Then they can get quite a bit of help.
Which is awful.
But
Yeah.
you know, these people that are trying to make it on $20,000 a year can't get any help.
Right.
A lot of us have a lot of stuff in our house for years, and it's all, we want to get rid of it. Material thing, but one place is Goodwill. Drop off some of that stuff that you've had, and eventually somebody who needs it will have that. So there are places where you can take your stuff that you want to do away with, don't throw it away. Take it to Goodwill and they'll take it.
They have awful high standards though. I know a lot of people take some stuff to Goodwill and they say, no, we don't want that. Really? Pretty much junk.
Yes. The Women's Center will take it.
The Women's Center.
We go about once a month or so. After a while, you know, the house is so full of stuff that,
Yeah.
take it there and then.
You know, when
Glad
I
to
was
take it.
single, way back when, as a school teacher, and I was a single mom, I made $6,000 enough, and it wasn't enough, but for me to have 1 meal a day.
Mm.
I mean, at school, thank heavens,
Mm.
my school had a wonderful cafeteria, and I could eat every day at school. I had $10 a month just so that there was something to eat.
Mm.
And there was not, so poor Dick didn't have a chance.
Several conversations back, an issue that you were addressing, I think, is personal responsibility. And I think that a lot of people, I guess I'm talking about myself, want to hand money out the car window to somebody who's going to use it on drugs or alcohol. And there was a group that was a club, it was a network club that I belonged to. And there was a little place called House of Tiny Treasures in downtown Houston, in the real old near University of Houston. And it was free care, if the mother, and it was usually a mother, either worked or was going to school, and they could have free childcare. So there was a stipulation there that gave the mother the responsibility to be personally responsible in some way. She couldn't be on drugs or alcohol, but these kids got free care.
Mm.
And how you separate the guy on the street that parks his car and goes and begs and says somebody offers him a job, he says, I make more money this way.
Mm-hmm.
Separate that kind of situation with the real need. And I think that's where a lot of us get in trouble because, well, my previous minister's wife said, well, the command was to give to the poor, not to ask them, what they were doing with the money.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have any answers. It's
Yeah.
just kind of a dilemma.
So I really like this term upstream ministries, that I learned that term from Rick Wirtz. And the idea is, there's a lot of stuff that flows down the stream, but there's a source from which it begins. And so some of the problems that we observe are really downstream things. So rather than, and there are a lot of ministries that address those downstream things, but Rick's heart is, and I share it, is let's go upstream, and then if we can grab stuff from up there, then it will reduce the downstream problems. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So and that's, honestly, one of the things I'm so thrilled about with our Fort Bend Hope is that's an upstream ministry, because we're addressing education, which I think is one of the places where we can really prevent a lot of the things that get bad down the line. Is, even just teaching a child to read it would alter the shape of the rest of their life if they knew how to get educated.
Fort Bend Hope is a good example of that.
Yeah, that's what I was just speaking of, but yeah, Fort Bend Hope. Mm-hmm.
I think it's what you're saying is these people, it's a cycle for them. It's just what they know. The grandma lives in the house, the parents live in it, the grandkids, and it's just gonna continue that way.
Right.
In these programs we have, the tutoring or the Fort Bend, if we can get in there, like you said, the upstream, and maybe one of those child, try to give them a little hope, and hopefully they'll branch out and break the cycle. But it's just so hard because it's taking just one person to stop it.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I'll bring up the violin shop one more time. So when I was there, one of the people that worked there was a young woman who was in that mode of, I'm going to have one more baby, because each child brought more money in per month. And she was like not wanting to work, because if she worked, then she would lose that income stream of having all of this. And but she was the cousin of somebody that worked in the shop, and we finally convinced her, your life is going to be better if you work than if you keep going down that route. And it was wonderful to see her stop that lifestyle, and her life was completely different. Her children's lives were totally different, but it was a wonderful place to work, and the owner of the shop wanted to see people's lives get better. And anyway, for whatever that's worth, let's move on to another thing. I wanted to have us take a look at Matthew. This is a real shift in our conversation, so I invite you to take a turn with me. But let's move to Matthew 4:8. Matthew 4:18 to 22. Matthew 4:18 to 22. And what this is one of the stories that we have where we find Jesus calling his disciples. So I'll just read it to you. It says in 4:18, as he walked by the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew, his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And he said to them, follow me, and I will make you fish for people. Immediately they left their nets and followed him. As they went from there, he saw two other brothers, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John, in the boat with their father Zebedee, mending their nets, and he called them. Immediately they left the boat and their father and followed him. So what we find here is Jesus acting in the role of rabbi, and he is going out and he is collecting his disciples. He's calling these disciples. And so I want to read to you just a bit from a website called That the World May Know, and it describes this rabbi and talmudim relationship. I mentioned this last week, but this is just a little bit more. So it says, both boys and girls in the time of Jesus, when a rabbi would go and collect this collection of students, it says both boys and girls began their study at age 4 or 5 in the elementary school and held in conjunction with the local synagogue. Children memorized large portions of the Torah by the time they finished this level of education. At this point, most students, and certainly the girls, stayed at home to help with the family, or in the case of the boys, to learn the family trade. The best students continued their study in the secondary school while learning a trade. Here they, along with the adults in the town, studied the prophets and the writings in addition to the Torah, and began to learn the interpretations of the oral Torah. A small number of the most outstanding students sought permission to study with a famous rabbi, often leaving home to travel with him for a lengthy period of time. And so that was the system that they had. So if you were asked to follow a rabbi, it was because you were the best of the best of the best, that you had advanced through these various educational levels. And so when a rabbi would, and actually the person would go to the rabbi and say and ask if they might follow, and then the rabbi would then decide whether or not this student had the potential to make the commitment to do this intense study. But most of these students that would go to a famous rabbi and ask if they may follow would be turned away. So we read in here in the Gospels about the way that Jesus called his students, and it's like it's the flip, because now instead of the students coming to the famous rabbi and asking, "May I follow?" he's going to the students and he's asking, or he's saying, "Follow me." And then instead of them being the best of the best of the best, being maybe 13 or so years old, he's going to grown men who have already learned the trade. Their life path has already gone in that direction, trade school, and they've learned to trade, and now he's going to them well after they've already made that shift. So here we have the most famous rabbi in the country, Jesus, and he is collecting not the best of the best of the best, but probably the least likely worst students he could find. So it's pretty interesting. Doug, you've been waiting patiently.
Well, what else I find interesting is looking back at the text just before this. And this is right after he'd been baptized by John.
Uh-huh.
Then he gone to the wilderness.
Okay.
Came back, and this is the next thing after that. He's walking along, he gets these guys, says, "Come on, join me." Do they even know who he is?
Right.
You know, it's not like he's a well-known, nationally known hero or anything like that. It's remarkable. They just
right.
throw it out and follow it.
Right. Well, if you read in verses 12 through 17, there is an indication that his ministry had already begun. So I don't know that it's following his temptation immediately. I think there was a period of time there, but it's a good point. It hasn't been very long that he's been in ministry. But the word "follow me," sometimes we've heard sermons and we've thought about it like if some hairy dude came up and said, "Follow me, would you go?" Mm-hmm. Well, we would obviously say no because we're rational people. But remember that in the time and in this culture, it was code language for I'm a famous rabbi. I want you to be one of my students. Will you follow me? And but it's a reversal of the normal, because normally you would go and ask, "May I follow you?" It's interesting too that even today, if you're in Israel, you will sometimes find a rabbi. You'll see a rabbi with a gaggle of boys, and they are literally following him around. That's what I observed. I saw this man and all these boys around him, and he was walking, and they would do like, if you ever get to go to Israel and study there, you'll do like we did with Jack Beck. We follow him around, and then he'll stop somewhere and teach. He'll see something, he'll point to it and teach, and then he'll go on, and we follow him along. But we observed that with a rabbi and his little Talmudim too. So it was an interesting image. And we find in Jesus's the way that he teaches, he travels to teach. He shows different things.
A question, these fishermen that Jesus chose, were they literate, or would they have heard of Jesus before he ever approached them?
I would assume that they would have known of him. I think that he had enough time in ministry that the reputation about him had already gotten around. He was collecting these guys in the area where he was preaching.
So they were aware of who he was.
I think so. I think that's more rational that's a more logical notion than complete and total stranger walking up to you, That's stranger danger, you don't.
Yeah, stranger danger.
But they did have their own houses. When I was there, Peter had a house, and I forget.
Right.
It was complaining.
Right. Yeah, they were not
But
poor
it's under
people.
glass,
Right.
Its foundations, it's all rock,
Mhm.
because it's a part of the structure is long gone, but,
Mhm.
so it isn't like they just walked down the road and slept in the.
Well, they all were gainfully employed.
Mhm.
Do we know anything about their families? So did they have wives and kids?
I don't know.
It's hard to say, but in that culture, it's kind of unlikely that they wouldn't.
Yeah.
So.
If you ever do get to go to Israel, you want to have Jack Beck as your tour guide.
Mhm.
He's absolutely
He
amazing.
had a wonderful one
He has
too.
an innate sense of what was real and what was authentic versus what was just hearsay.
So we talked last week some about how the kinds of people that God likes to call to be part of what He's doing. It's not necessarily the people that you would expect. Remember, we talked about that last week, and so we're touching on that again today. There was, if you read in the chapter, the author was talking about how she felt a call, but then she had her list of buts, like, but I can't do this, but I shouldn't do that, and, but this isn't a good time. And she had a list of excuses for not doing what it was that God had called her to do. But then as she said yes to what God had for her, what that brought to her was a whole different view of the world and a complete different understanding of people that she had run into and what was possible for God to do in people's lives. And so it was really a wonderful thing that she was able to get past that and then follow what God was asking her to do. There is a story, another story that's told, and it's on page 43 in the book. And this is about her experience with the art project in Houston. And she talks about this one person that she encountered, a person who was experiencing homelessness. And so on page 43, it says, one day, a project I was working with invited a local jewelry artist to come and lead a jewelry making workshop at the homeless shelter. I went from table to table along with the interns who worked with me, encouraging everyone to participate. We were able to get a few to reluctantly come and try. We kept saying, you won't know if you like it or what you're capable of until you try. One man stared blank-faced at the supplies placed before him and said to me, Pastor, I can't do this. I ain't never done anything like this before. What do you mean, friend? I quickly retorted. You can do anything you put your mind to. You'll see. Believe. I then walked away and joined in the activities myself. By the end of the workshop, every person who sat at the table had created at least one bracelet. Their faces showed such a sense of accomplishment, joy, and delight. One person even said, this was so much fun, I almost forgot I was at the shelter. When I was at a community festival a few months later, a gentleman walked up to me and asked, Pastor, do you remember me? His face looked vaguely familiar, but I could not recall how we met. Seeing that my mind was scrolling through a Rolodex of faces, he decided to help me out. I was at the shelter early in the summer, and I did your jewelry class. Really? Wow. It was the man at the table. I honestly had not seen him since that workshop. It is so good to see you, friend. How are you? Well, I'm good. I've been meaning to get down to the shelter to talk to you. I wanted to let you know when you told me at the table I could do anything I put my mind to, something happened in me. When I got up the next morning, I started hustling to find a decent place to live so I could get a good job. I was only at the shelter for 2 nights. Now I work for this nonprofit as the groundskeeper. Thank you for that class and for the love. I'm doing really good. Through that experience and others, over my time at the homeless shelter, I learned that just as we hunger for bread and thirst for water, we also hunger and thirst to encounter beauty within and without. All of us long to create, co-create, and contribute to this world. I feel that this is an innate need born of God, and the experience is meant not just for a privileged few, but for all. One of the powerful ways Jesus liberates us is to affirm the wonderful truth that we are all distinctly created and endowed with gifts to participate in God's work in the world. The empowering Word of God expressed in love around an art table was enough for my friend to maintain hope and persevere until he found the new life God and he desired for him to have. So all of that was possible because she was willing to step into the ministry that God had put in front of her that she at first didn't want to do, and because the man was willing to step out of himself and do something that he didn't think he could do. We could say about that story that there was a lot of being set free going on. In what ways do you see the light of God shining through that story? So when you consider what takes place in that story, how do you see the light of God shining through?
Well, they both took a step of faith.
Yeah, they both took a step of faith, yeah.
And you never know what spark you can light in somebody.
Yeah.
To experience
Right.
something and grasp it, you know?
Yeah, you never know what's going to spark somebody. And all she was doing was walking around the tables going, how's it going? You know?
Make a bracelet.
Yeah.
It's kind of like in my own life, when I was in high school, I had no idea that I wanted to go to college, and my physics teacher in high school said, well, why not give it a try? So I said, okay, I'll give it a try. And turns out I was the first person in my family to ever go to college.
Wow.
You got the encouragement.
That one
So
little,
it was a little spark.
that one little thing, yeah.
In my life, I recall, I had a cousin that was a fireman and I was a policeman. Our first year of college was at our local junior college because we had no university really close by. Well, one of the required courses in California for an associate's degree was you had to take speech. And I wasn't a speaker, he wasn't a speaker, and the teachers that taught speech were the same ones that taught my parents, so they'd been there that long, and their reputation was they were that hard. And so a year later, well, 4 years later, I have my bachelor's degree and I've gone on. My cousin, the fireman, had over 200 credit hours at the junior college when you could get an associate's degree at 60 hours, but he could not pass speech. And I thought in my life, other than being forced to take dumbbell English before you could move on to college English, and being forced to take speech, if anything contributed to any success or things I achieved in my life, it was because I was forced to take speech and I was forced to take dumbbell English. And it turned out I had skills in both.
Awesome, thank you.
I can say amen to that because I'm an interior designer and I used to be asked to give talks in colleges and universities and so forth. And I would get up and my heart would pound and I'd be short of breath and everything. So one January at a networking club, this is during the 80s, during the one of those years, everybody was looking for business. I got up and said my goal this year is to become a better public speaker. And somebody said to me, you need to come to Toastmasters. And I said, well, I know about it, sort of, but I didn't really know. Well, Toastmasters changed my life. And I know God put me there. After I got into the initial manual to about number 8 stage, I did lose my fear. It was amazing. So no matter what you're selling, like you're selling Christianity, right? If you can't articulate your idea, it doesn't have any value in the world. It might be great, inside of have this wonderful idea. But if you can articulate it and sell it, I just think some companies make their certain employees go to Toastmasters. In the club that I was in most of the time, there was an engineer, and he had to make these boring presentations. And they were still boring, but at least he learned, not to freeze up and go blank and all that. So, anyway.
Good. Thank you.
So I like to comment about that.
Diana?
Well, back to this, sometimes we don't give ourselves permission to do something until we get an outside word of encouragement. And then once we get that affirmation, then we say, okay, well, maybe there's a possibility that I could do that.
Yeah. Cindy?
I always love to see when I meet people that are retired and they have always had a talent, but they never knew it. And then, in retirement, whether it's just because they were bored and they were looking for a class or they wanted to meet people or a friend encouraged them to come along, they find out they have this talent that's amazing. And they never really knew it was there because they never either had the encouragement or the time to explore it, and then it gets unleashed. I think that's.
Thank you. Yeah, it's good.
I hope for that in God, but it never
It
will.
never happened.
So we're going to wrap up, but I wanted to encourage you since we all have the capacity to spark something in someone else if we would take the moment to speak it. And so the encouragement for us is to join Jesus in setting people free. And it may be that just the one little encouraging word that God puts on your heart to speak is all it takes. So don't discount what God can do through you and take that step. Let's pray. We're grateful, God, for your Son Jesus and the way that he calls people just like us to be part of your saving work. We know, God, that there is an abundance of grace and there are so many opportunities for us to share your love. So as we go from here, God, we pray that you would encourage us and inspire us to be people who bring an encouraging word and offer to others the gift of love that you've given to us in Jesus. We pray this in his name. Amen.
Amen.